the Muslims found themselves in possession really of the great philosophical centres in the world, because these European fringes, the north, have no tradition of philosophical thought at all. The Muslims are ruling the Mediterranean world, and so they find, first of all, the great patriarchal centres of Christianity are in their hands, which had their own associated schools of theology and philosophy. So Alexandria, very important intellectually, becomes a Muslim city. Antioch, which in some ways was the cradle of Christianity, Jerusalem itself becomes a Muslim city. And also, the entire Persian-speaking Zoroastrian world is absorbed into this new Muslim caliphate. And that is the fact that I think is most significant in understanding the later direction of Islamic thought. The fact that Islam breaks down the hugely important cultural divide between the Iranian world and the Mediterranean world. And its later intellectual history has to be interpreted in terms of Islam's reuniting of those areas. Reuniting because, of course, it had been done earlier, 1,000 years earlier, by Alexander the Great. One reason why he has two horns, or is identified with the man of two horns in the Quran, is because Qarn means an age or an epoch or an area, and he is the one that unites the West and the East, which is what Islam did. Something Christendom never did, but Islam united the East and the West. And Persia, really no less than the Greek world, is an important ingredient in the crucible of Islamic civilization. Persia, of course, has close ties to India. And this fertile tension between the two worlds, the Mediterranean and the Persian, is represented by the transferal of the capital of the Muslim Caliphate in 751 from Damascus, Christian, deeply Hellenized city, to the new city of Baghdad in the core territory of the Persian world. And that indicates the way in which Islam straddled these two universes. Not only did it inherit the philosophy, the medical traditions, the scientific irrigating methods of those two worlds and juxtaposed them with some very fertile results, but also it straddled on a larger scale the great trading routes of the pre-modern Old World. The stories of Sinbad the Sailor, obviously legendary, but indicating how important seafaring was to classical Islamic civilization. And it's important to grasp this point because medieval Islam, which sprawled over this gigantic area, so much larger than contemporary Christendom, was a very mercantile civilization. Trade was important and trade was prestigious in a way that in some other civilizations it wasn't. In traditional Hindu civilization, it's not a prestigious thing to be a trader. You're third from the top on the caste hierarchy. But of course the Prophet himself had been a merchant, and it was seen as a perfectly natural thing for a man of religion, a man of piety, to travel, to trade, even to become wealthy. Which has the very important consequence of making traders and merchants, not all of them in the Islamic world were Muslims, quite a few were Jews. Sometimes those who traded with Europe were Genoese or Venetians. But it meant that the traders were, in very many cases, deeply religious men. So they were carrying not just Muslim goods and services around the world, but they were also carrying the religion itself. And one of the key factors in the spread of the religion is, after the initial period, the fact that piety can be combined with a mercantile outlook. And of course the merchant has to deal with people of every possible religious background. So medieval Islam was profoundly mobile. This is an important aspect of it. Partly because of this mercantile piety, partly because it straddled the world's great east-west and also north-south trade routes, and also because Islam didn't have a feudal system. One of the reasons for the rapidity and permanence of the conquest was that it actually abolished the Byzantine and Visigothic feudal systems. There was no concept of a serf being really owned by his lord and tied to the land. Populations immediately became much more mobile. Communication's often very good, so the royal post between Damascus and Cairo generally took just 3 days. 3 days from Damascus to Cairo. The most sophisticated pre-modern postal system was generally that of the Middle East. Carmen, did you have a question?
Yes. I read in some chronicle that Medina del Campo, throughout the 15th century, was the most important center for not only for the Iberian Peninsula, but the Iberian Peninsula. Medina del Campo is about 3 hours by train northwest of Madrid, on the left side. Anyhow, the traders at that point, this particular chronicle described that the traders that did, I can't remember the name in English, but the ones that bought the bulk and brought their goods from other parts, right, there were all these Muslim traders, but it was the women. At this particular fair, there were several fairs throughout the year, and it was the women that sold and had their small shops. And not only that, but a professor of mine found evidence that these women had unions in order to keep prices throughout, like all the ones that sold embroideries, would keep their prices on that. So it was the women that were doing the small, that had their little shops, and then they would buy bulk from the men that bought the fabrics or threads or whatever it was in order for. So anyhow, this was interesting.
Yeah, and that was, I think, at least in many periods, quite representative. You wouldn't find it in the Ottoman Empire, but in earlier periods you would find women as major traders. And of course the religious archetype for that is Khadija. If the Prophet's wife could do it, then why shouldn't other Muslim women? Omar, the second caliph, actually appointed a woman to be the chief market inspector in Medina. Okay, so I've talked about the mobility of medieval Islam. Perhaps I should also mention the class mobility that became possible in Islam in a way that wasn't possible certainly in India, but also wasn't possible in feudal Europe. There were plenty of cases of people rising to the top from the social depths. And if you look at the social background of many of the medieval Muslim theologians, you'll find that actually they were of village origin, because religious education was free of charge. So you have this huge area, which is really a customs union, suddenly created from the Pyrenees to the frontiers of China. Customs duties, frontier posts abolished in this gigantic area. And we can say then that the first non-political impact of Islam on world history, before the intellectual impact, was actually the economic one. And part of this was due to Islamic law and the lack of heavy feudal elite, whereas the Byzantine and Sassanid heavy cavalry had been financed by very heavy land taxes and imposts on commercial goods. The needs of the Umayyad and the early Abbasid state actually seem to have been pretty modest.